The morning the wind carried a veil of red dust across Willow Creek. Hanny Bright stood on a wooden crate behind the front counter of Bright Oven, tacking up a fresh notice. The page flapped stubbornly, as though the air itself wanted to argue with her. Help needed strong hands, good heart. Work in exchange for wages and hot meals. She stepped down, brushed her apron clean of flour, and looked around her little bakery. The place was warm, humming, and alive with the kind of quiet chaos only women could manage before dawn, rolling dough, stoking the big oak-fired oven, and moving sacks of flour that were nearly as heavy as they were. The air smelled of yeast, cinnamon, and a steady determination born from years of making a life with very little. But outside that warm glow was a town growing meaner by the week. News of the proposed ore processing plant had spread like a bad rumor, turning Willow Creek skittish. Cattle ranchers whispered about poisoned water. Farmers muttered about ruined soil. And Hanny herself, who had spoken against the plant at the last town gathering, had earned more than flour-thrown insults for her trouble. The night before, 3 drunken cowhands had pounded on the bakery door long after closing. They weren't looking for bread. Her girls had been frightened young women, with soft hands and soft shoulders, not made for pushing back against rough men. That was why she needed help. A man's presence, even just his shadow, could steady the place. Someone strong enough to haul the 100 ball flour sacks, fix what needed fixing, and if it came to it, stand at the door when someone pounded too hard. But so far, every applicant had been either lazy, drunk, or running from the law. She sighed, wiping her brow with the back of her wrist. Lord, send me someone who can lift a sack of flour without complaining, she murmured, or at least someone who won't frighten my girls. She didn't expect an answer, not that morning, not ever. But the wind shifted. Bootsteps sounded on the porch, slow, steady, firm. The kind of steps that meant a man carried his weight evenly, like someone used to walking farther than most folks rode. Honey turned just as the stranger pushed open the door. He stood tall, maybe 6'2", with long black hair, tied loosely at the nape of his neck, a broad chest dusted with the desert's red powder, and the quiet watchfulness of a man who never entered any place unprepared. His boots were worn but cared for, his shirt patched but clean. The line of his jaw was strong, shadowed by several days without shaving, and his eyes, dark, steady, unreadable, met hers. For half a heartbeat, everything in the warm bakery slowed. Flour drifted lazily in the air. The fire crackled softer. Even the chatter of her girls behind her dipped into silence. Then Hanny straightened her spine, as she always did when something in her chest tried to flutter. "Can I help you, sir?" The man removed his hat, not out of courtesy she sensed, but out of habit. "Saw your notice," he said, voice low and even. "Came to ask about the work." His accent was soft, but unmistakably Apache. Hanny felt the weight of it, not fear, not prejudice, but an awareness of how this town tended to look at men like him. Willow Creek wasn't known for kindness toward native folks. And yet, something in his manner held no threat, only a kind of patient gravity, like he'd carried burdens bigger than this dusty little town could imagine. "What's your name?" she asked. He hesitated, not out of deception she sensed, but caution. Then he said, "Edward. Edward Nez." "Well, Edward Nez," Hanny said, wiping her hands on her apron. "We could use someone with strong arms, and someone who doesn't mind early mornings." A quiet rumble of a laugh barely there escaped him. "Early mornings are familiar." She grabbed a sack of flour from the stack nearby, trying to lift it as demonstration. It barely budged. Without a word, Edward stepped forward, took the sack with one hand, and hoisted it onto his shoulder, as though it weighed no more than a bundle of rags. The girls behind her gasped. Hanny nodded slowly, hiding her impressed smile. All right, you can lift. She pointed to the back of the shop. Door hinge broke again. Think you can manage it? Edward set the flower down gently, walked to the hinge, and examined it with a sharp, practiced eye. From his belt pouch, he drew a small bone-handled tool, carved with patterns she didn't recognize, and in less than a minute, the hinge sat straighter than she'd ever seen it. He stepped back. Won't creak now. And it didn't. Something warm uncurled in her chest, unexpected and unsettling. Thank you. He dipped his head, then looked around the bakery, slowly taking in each woman, each corner, each crack in the walls without judgment, only understanding. The kind a man learned from spending long years reading Land and People. I'll take the job, he said simply. Annie swallowed. All right then. Pay is fair, meals included. Girls here work hard, so I don't allow trouble. You give them no reason to fear you, and we'll get along fine. Edward met her eyes with a quiet solemnity. No one here needs to fear me. And there was something in the way he said it, soft, almost sad, that made her wonder what kind of life he'd walked through before stepping into her bakery. But she didn't pry. People in the West came with secrets. You learn to respect them, or lose good folk. Well then, she said, offering her hand. Welcome to Bright Oven. His hand closed around hers, warm, strong, steady. A simple handshake. Yet Annie felt, in some place she couldn't name, that she had just opened her door to more than a hired hand. Something had shifted in Willow Creek that morning, quiet as red dust settling, certain as the sun rising over desert stone. The days that followed settled into a rhythm, as warm and steady as the big oak oven in Bright Oven. Dawn came with pale gold light stretching over the rooftops, catching on the dust that never truly left Willow Creek. The bakery woke earlier, now that there was a man in the back room, lifting flour, splitting kindling, and fixing what had been left broken for too long. Edward Niz worked without complaint. He didn't boast, didn't hurry, and didn't waste even half a movement. The women who had once tiptoed around him now carried on their chatter, glancing his way only when a crate needed moving. Even the shyest girl, Maggie, no longer flinched when he passed behind her. Still, Annie sensed something coiled behind his quiet. An alertness, a listening, a watchfulness, like a man who expected trouble, even in a room full of cinnamon and sugar. And trouble had indeed been brewing. Willow Creek talked of little else but the ore processing plant Hale Mining intended to build down along the river. A place that once fed cattle and watered rows of beans would soon be choked with tailings and waste. Annie had seen enough to stand against it. Old Mature, Turner's creekside field, had already turned sour from early ore washing upstream. His cattle were drinking less. The alfalfa wilted around the edges. Annie brought her concerns to the town meeting, nervous, heart pounding. She'd expected resistance, but she hadn't expected to be laughed at by men who never had to knead dough or gather clean water before sunrise. The lady baker thinks she knows more than engineers, Vernon Hale had said, leaning on his cane made from polished horn. Pretty thing like you shouldn't trouble yourself with man's business. The memory still burned hot in her chest. And ever since she spoke out, the bakery had become a target. First, it was crude words scrawled on her window. Then rocks 3 in one night, shattering the small panes she'd saved weeks to install. One evening, 2 men, drunk on rye whiskey, had pounded the back door until Maggie cried. But that night, Edward had stepped from the shadows. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't raise his fists. He simply stood, big and immovable as an old pine in winter. The men backed away, after one look at him, a look that said he'd seen their kind before and did not fear them. When Annie thanked him later, he only shook his head. No thanks needed. but she saw the faint scrape on his knuckle, as though one of those men had tested him before retreating. A week passed, the mornings colder, the evenings filled with uneasy whispers. Hanny noticed Edward walk the perimeter of the bakery before locking up each night. He paused at corners most men never looked at. He listened to the wind as if it carried tracks instead of dust. Once, when she brought him a mug of warm coffee during the early dark hours, she found him crouched near the back step. "What is it?" she whispered. He pointed toward the ground. "Footprints. 3 sets. Not yours." Her stomach tightened. "When?" "Last night," he said. They stayed a while. A shiver crept up her arms despite the heat of the cup she held. Edward stood. His voice softened, though his eyes didn't. "You should lock the door sooner and keep the lamp burning." "Do you think they'll come back?" He didn't answer. That itself was an answer. Still, she refused to let fear take up space in her bakery. So she focused on her work and her women, keeping spirits high, checking the locks twice, sometimes 3 times. But she could not ignore the way Edward had begun watching the street as he chopped wood, or how he lingered near the windows when shadows stretched long. One night, after the others had gone home, Hanny found Edward quietly repairing a jammed drawer beside the flour bins. The soft glow of a kerosene lamp flickered over his hands. His shirt sleeves were rolled, showing strong forearms marked with faint scars, some long ago, some not so old. As he worked, a small object slid from beneath his collar, a leather cord, woven in a pattern she didn't recognize, with a carved bone pendant shaped like flowing water. It was beautiful in its simplicity, and older than anything one could buy in Willow Creek's trading post. She realized then that he wasn't merely a drifter. The way he moved, the way he looked outward instead of inward. A man shaped by lands much bigger than this town, by responsibilities she couldn't name. He felt her gaze and tucked the pendant back beneath his shirt. "Didn't mean to stare," she said softly. "It just caught the light." "It's nothing," he murmured. But his voice held the weight of a man who carried too many secrets. Hanny wanted to ask more, but she had learned long ago that the West was built on unspoken things. So instead, she offered him a bowl of the fresh peach cobbler she'd made for the morning crowd. He accepted it with a nod, sitting at the far end of the table like someone who had spent years eating alone. After a quiet moment, Hanny tried a smile. "Do you ever get tired of being so serious?" He looked up, startled, not offended. She continued, "You're always working, always fixing things, always watching. Do you ever just rest, Edward?" His gaze lingered on her for a long second. Then, "I rest when the ground is quiet," he said. "Lately it hasn't been." His words chilled her, not because of what he said, but because of how certain he was. Trouble wasn't just near, it was already circling. The next morning, as she swept the storefront, Hanny spotted 2 men she didn't recognize leaning against a hitching post across the road, pretending to smoke while their eyes stayed fixed on Bright Oven. Their clothes were clean, their boots were new, they weren't drifters, they were scent. Hanny inhaled sharply, and when she turned, she found Edward standing behind her, not close enough to startle her, but close enough that she felt steadier. He followed her gaze toward the men, then back to her. His voice was quiet, but iron strong. "They're watching you. I know. You shouldn't face this alone." Something warm, something dangerous stirred in her chest. "Then it's good you're here," she whispered. Edward didn't smile, but something in the set of his shoulders softened, as though he had been waiting for those words. And for the first time, Hanny understood. This man had not wandered into her bakery by accident. Whether she knew it or not, whether he admitted it or not, Their fates had already begun to draw together like flour and water under steady odds. The night the truth crept into Hanny Bright's life did not arrive with gunfire or shattered glass. It came instead on soft moccasin steps in the alley, behind Bright Oven, so quiet the wind almost carried them away. It was near closing time. The lamps were low, the air warm with the scent of cooling bread. Hanny was wiping down the counter when she heard a murmur, low, rhythmic, not English. She froze, listening. The voices came from behind the bakery, where only Edward stored lumber and broken crates. Her heartbeat quickened, not with fear, but with a strange intuition. Something was wrong, or perhaps something long hidden was finally coming into the light. She moved quietly through the kitchen, pushing open the back door just a sliver. What she saw stole her breath. 4 Apache men stood in a half circle, shadows cast long under the moonlight. Their hair was braided, their clothes dusted by long travel, and at the center of them stood Edward. His posture was different, no longer the quiet hired hand tending to flour sacks, but a man who belonged among warriors, a man who had once stood in front of people expecting him to lead. One of the men spoke in Apache, the tone urgent, almost pleading. The others bowed their heads. Edward stared at the ground, fists at his sides. Tension cut into the lines of his shoulders. Hanny pushed the door open a little more, just enough for the hinge to creak. All 4 men stiffened. Edward turned first, every muscle coiling as if to shield her. Hanny? His voice was still low in volume, but something sharper rested beneath it. You should be inside. I heard voices, she murmured. I didn't mean to intrude. The oldest of the Apache men stepped forward, lifting his chin. His gaze held strength without hostility. We come for Nez, he said in accented but clear English. His place is not here. Hanny blinked. Here? At the bakery? The man's eyes narrowed slightly, studying her, perhaps surprised she would speak so plainly. Edward stepped between them, before the tension could thicken. Go inside, Hanny. His tone wasn't harsh, but it was chiseled from the same stone that shaped mountains firm, immovable. She shook her head. No, not until you tell me what this is. Edward didn't move for several seconds. The silence throbbed like a heartbeat between them. Finally, he exhaled, turning to the men. Give me a moment. They exchanged glances, then stepped back into shadow. Edward faced her fully then. His features softened, though strain still clung to the edges. I should have told you, he said. But I didn't want to bring trouble to your door. Hanny crossed her arms not in anger, but in steadiness. Edward, who are you really? He looked toward the distant hills, where moonlit ridges traced the outline of Apache land. His voice, when it came, felt older than he was. My name is Edward Nez, but among my people, it carries more weight. He paused. I was born to be heir to the council of the Inde. Hanny swallowed, hard. An heir, she repeated softly. He nodded. I was trained to lead, trained to watch the land, to speak for our people. But years ago, after a raid, things went wrong. My brother died in a fight that shouldn't have happened. It was a choice I made to push too far, to trust the wrong whisper. They wanted me to take my brother's place at the council fire, but I couldn't carry that weight. Not then. His voice faltered, just enough for her to hear the scar beneath the words. So I left, he finished. I walked away from who I was supposed to be. Hanny stepped closer, her heartbeat steadying with something new. Not fear, but understanding. Empathy. And now they want you